Among Muslims is fun. It's interesting. I did it for about 5 years, and it got to the point where some of them were threatening me. So that was where I was like, okay, maybe I want to reconsider my living situation and kind of move somewhere else because I was living in Dearborn area and they were threatening me for giving out Bibles. And I was like, okay, there's a lot worse things I could be doing than giving out Bibles. But to them, that's a pretty serious thing for giving out Bibles. And they're not happy about you giving out Bibles. But I think that giving them Bibles can help them to get closer to the truth. And if they just start reading the New Testament, I was giving them John and Romans because those are the ideal books for a Muslim to start learning about Jesus, in the book of John and Romans. And the things that I was giving them also have some apologetics in it, so then it explains it. Because just reading John and Romans, if you're coming from an unsaved background, like I was raised public school, just like everybody else, not in a Christian home, not going to church every week. We tried a couple churches, didn't like them, and, didn't go back. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to Christianity. I didn't know who Jesus was as, a child growing up until I was about 20. That's when I learned who Jesus was. So that's really important, knowing who Jesus is. And you need to ask your kids, even if they claim they're a Christian, who is Jesus? Because if they don't know who he is, they don't believe in him, And Jesus is not a man. And that's something that, all the Muslims will tell you. Jesus is a good man. That's it. He's just a man. And that's something that also the Jewish people will tell you. And I tried to live in between the Muslims and the Jews because I thought, like, I can reach both. This is great. I can outreach to both of these people. But going through numerous, like, personal trials in my marriage, and then the Muslims kept threatening me, it was just like, this is getting uncomfortable. So I decided to move away, especially after my visit to Hamtramck. That was wild. I visited Hamtramck and made a video about it, and it upset like a lot of people because when you're raised kind of in the country and then you come into this really city environment where it's just like people everywhere and most of them are Muslim, you just feel really out of place. So I was making comments during my video, which I pulled down because I didn't want to keep upsetting everybody. But I was like, wow, this is really crazy. This is wild in Hamtramck. Wow, what's going on here? And you don't see prostitution. I spent most of the time growing up on my grandpa's farm. So that's where I visited a lot. And there's no prostitutes out there, guaranteed. So you don't see a lot of prostitution in the cities where I've lived. Maybe in Saginaw, but I only lived there as a child. So I never saw a lot of prostitution. So I was like, whoa, this is wild. Like, there's a prostitute right there. So, but yeah, Hamtramck's interesting. It's scary. It's intimidating if you're from the country or from northern Michigan to go down to Hamtramck. It's pretty intimidating. But I did end up in like Oak Park area living there, and that's right near 8 Mile. So you're exposed to a lot of stuff down there. So eventually I got to where I was like, okay, this is just normal. But before that, it wasn't normal to see corpses laying on the ground bleeding and police everywhere. You eventually get to where like, okay, this is just normal. But at first it's just not normal, and you're a little like freaked out by this. But one of the big things is to understand is that Jesus is not a man. And if you believe he's just a man, like, he can't save you because he claimed to be God. And he went to the man that was sick of the palsy. And if you have like a handicapped child, it's, that story comes to life. If you've seen a child that's very sick, handicapped, then it comes to life. And you understand how big of a deal this is, that he's healing a child that's sick of the palsy. So, and he goes to the child, and everybody expects him to just heal the palsy, heal the child, and then, move on to the next person. And that's not what he does. He says, "Thy sins are forgiven thee." So, for him to say, "Your sins are forgiven you," they got very upset. The Pharisees were very upset because only God can forgive sin. So, what Jesus is saying there is, I'm God. I have the power of God. That's how I can forgive sins. And the Pharisees are like, "What? Why would you say that? Why would you say you can forgive sins? You're just supposed to heal him and move on, just do your good works and move on, why are you telling him this kind of thing?" And Jesus says, is it easier to forgive sins or to, heal somebody, to heal a handicapped child, heal a blind man, and he was making the dumb to speak, the deaf to hear, the blind to see. He was healing all sorts of things that doctors can't heal even today. Doctors can't heal these things. So he was doing miracles, and the miracles were just kind of like, just like a duck in the water, just rolling off their back. So then he says, "Your sins are forgiven you." And that's just putting, the final nail in the coffin. Obviously, he was God. That's why he was doing all these miracles. But then to say, "Your sins are forgiven you," that's claiming and taking that title of deity. So they were very upset. And he said, what is easier, to forgive somebody's sins or to heal somebody who's handicapped? So kind of stumped them with this. And both are miracles, but when somebody's forgiven of their sins, we just don't see it. So we don't think about what a miracle that is. We can see some of the evidence. Like when I converted to Christianity, I just didn't have any desire to drink ever again. Haven't drank in 17 years. So you can look at that and be like, wow, how could somebody go 17 years without drinking alcohol? So you can see some of the things there, but it just is so wild that he's forgiving sins. But if you can't see it, then you don't really understand what's happening there. So, but there's some of the effects that you can see where somebody stops drinking, stops smoking, doesn't use any drugs, that kind of thing. Like my life was radically changed from being completely out in the world to being devout Christian. So, and a devout Christian is really devoted. They're not drinking, they're not smoking, they're not using drugs, they're reading the Bible, they're going to church, they're dressing conservatively. Like there's a lot of things to being devout, where a lot of people say, "I'm a devout." No, you're not, not quite. Look at their life and see what it is really about. But is it more of a miracle to heal somebody of a handicap or to forgive their sins, is what he's asking them. And, what's more important? Healing somebody and, forgiving their sins, taking away the guilt that they feel. And there's a lot of guilt. Before you're a Christian, you're kind of like, what do I do with this guilt? When I was an atheist, it was like, you're doing some things that are wrong, obviously. I wasn't a really, really bad person as an atheist, so I can't say I was like super, super convicted, but there's always some guilt, like, oh, I obviously shouldn't have said that or shouldn't have done that. And you feel a little bit bad, and you're like, what do I do with this guilt? But after you become a Christian, the guilt is gone, and then you have a clean slate. So then you feel, a lot better mentally. So mentally, you're in a much better spot, and it creates that resilience. So, but which is easier, to heal somebody of their sins and, heal them mentally, spiritually, or to be physically healed? And that's the big question. But being forgiven and knowing that you're going to heaven is obviously much more important than just getting healing on this earth. So sometimes there isn't healing on this earth and you're not going to get healed. Some things I have seen physical healing, and sometimes it was just like God revealed oh, you have a vitamin deficiency, so you need to take a vitamin. Like, I would pray, why am I feeling, so low? I don't have any energy. I don't feel good. Why don't I feel good? And then he starts showing you, well, look into this, we'll look into that. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, it's iron deficiency. So then take iron and you feel better. Sometimes he's leading you down a path of learning about the body to get to the root of the problem in order to be healed. And that's happened several times with different people where they had something and I started researching it and I was like, just try this. And then they tried it and they were healed. So it can be that. Sometimes it can just be like a miraculous healing where sometimes that's happened where you can't explain it. You can't understand how did this happen, but it did happen. So there can be some of that. And I'm not saying those people that are like, you're healed, you're healed, you're healed are right. Because that's not necessarily, no, that doesn't necessarily work that way. But if you're praying for somebody to be healed, sometimes they can miraculously be healed. Not all the time, but sometimes. And other times, God's saying you need to get more information about your body and figure out about your diet and vitamins and stuff like that in order to be healed. And that's happened before too. Obviously, like, Jesus isn't still walking the earth. So these kind of healings that he was doing when he was on the earth isn't happening the same to that degree. But there is some healing too. So, but basically, your sins being forgiven and you going to heaven is the greatest thing that you can have. So even if you're not physically healed, just knowing that your sins are forgiven and you're going to heaven is the greatest healing work that he can do. And that's what he was trying to explain. But only God can do that. Only God can forgive sins. And no other man has ever claimed to forgive sins. Like Muhammad didn't claim to forgive your sins. Buddha didn't claim to forgive your sins. Only Jesus forgives sins. So that's how we know he's not a man.